Welcome back to This Explainer. Today, we're looking at a truly fascinating business case study of what happens when a foundational operating assumption completely collapses. We're going to examine China's current energy dilemma at the Strait of Hormuz. But we aren't just going to look at the geopolitics here. Instead, we're framing this as a massive corporate business strategy that literally just hit an iceberg, and the total scramble that follows when elegant theory meets brutal reality. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break things down into 4 quick parts today. First, the operating assumption. Then, how reality breaks the model. Next, we'll explore a doctrine in crisis. And finally, the pivoting to wartime footing. It's a clear 4-part breakdown of a massive system failure. Let's get right to it.
All right, Section 1, the operating assumption.
So any good business strategy requires a baseline, right? A set of rules that governs investment, capital allocation, and risk management. And for years, China's energy security establishment operated on an elegant but ultimately flawed business strategy, one that deliberately optimized for rapid economic growth over really expensive worst-case security planning. The absolute core of that strategy is what we call the 3-month clock. This was Beijing's foundational operating doctrine. Basically, it assumes that any major global oil disruption, especially at a vital choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, would naturally resolve within weeks due to immense collective economic pressure. It was a model built entirely on the idea that global markets simply wouldn't tolerate a long-term shutdown. And honestly, the if-then logic of their strategy was incredibly seductive. Step 1, the Strait of Hormuz closes. Step 2, global oil prices violently spike. Step 3, this causes universal economic pain. And step 4, because nobody, not the US, not Iran, literally no one, can sustain that pain, it forces a swift collective resolution. The oil just flows again. It's a really clean, highly logical model, which explains exactly why it was so believable and widely adopted across all their institutions. And we have to remember, this wasn't just some fringe theory. Take a listen to this quote from Yoon Sun, published in War on the Rocks. She documented that Chinese Middle East specialists and oil executives consistently argued that China's oil security is susceptible, but not vulnerable. They believed an energy crisis caused by a regional conflict in the Middle East will not be sustainable. In corporate terms, they accepted a manageable level of risk. They were deeply, deeply confident that the market's own self-correcting mechanisms would save them from total vulnerability. So what's absolutely crucial to understand here is how this single assumption basically dictated their entire operational posture. Because they completely trusted that 3-month clock, they only felt the need to make moderate energy security investments, and that kept immense amounts of capital freed up, keeping their primary focus directed squarely on rapid economic growth. It also meant they could assume standard, totally non-urgent timelines for pipeline construction, and they only needed to build out a strategic reserve size covering roughly 3 months. They essentially optimized for efficiency, building a lean, just-in-time supply chain for energy that assumed the true worst-case scenario was, well, practically impossible. It left absolutely no room for error. Which brings us to Section 2, Reality Breaks the Model. Now, this is where we shift gears from comfortable theory to a brutal, real-world stress test. Because when a theoretical business model violently collides with an unpredictable reality, things unravel, and they unravel fast. Right now, we are approaching month 3 of the Strait of Hormuz closure. The situation is actively outlasting the doctrine. This is the exact moment their foundational assumption that universal pain forces a quick resolution is being completely destroyed in real time. The clock has, for all intents and purposes, run out. Now, what's really interesting here is this number, $1 million. That is the jarring, almost unbelievable toll Iran is currently charging per ship just to pass through the strait. So instead of forcing a quick peace, the economic pain isn't magically resolving the issue. It's simply being monetized by the people controlling the bottleneck. And then you hit the physical, logistical nightmares, 16 to 24 weeks. That's the number of weeks required just for mine clearance in the strait. Think about that compared to a 12-week, 3-month doctrine. The physical market variables have completely refused to conform to Beijing's neat, rapid resolution spreadsheet. Even if some diplomatic miracle happened today, the physical reality on the ground dictates months of continued disruption. Just trace the ongoing crisis timeline. The ceasefire collapses. The US imposes a blockade. And, perhaps most devastating for that 3-month doctrine, analysts at Transglobal are now forecasting that the earliest expected resolution might not be until the end of 2026. That is years, not weeks. In corporate strategy terms, an error margin of years rather than weeks is flat-out catastrophic. The foundational business model hasn't just been stressed, it has been completely shattered. So we enter Section 3, a doctrine in crisis. When an enterprise builds its entire supply chain and risk management profile around a single assumption, the failure of that one assumption doesn't just create a localized problem, it breaks the entire system. Let's revisit Yoon Sun's analysis for a second. As she noted, Chinese interlocutors consistently denied the need for China to develop a military presence in the region, citing the improbability of a total loss of China's energy access there. Because they were so confident in their risk management profile, they actively chose not to invest in the heavy military overhead that would be required to actually protect those supply lines. It was a calculated cost-saving measure, and it is spectacularly backfiring. So the crucial point is this massive cascade of operational failures. Their strategic reserve sizing is instantly invalidated, because remember, it was planned for weeks, not months. Their pipeline investment urgency has proven completely insufficient for a prolonged crisis. There's a complete absence of the necessary military presence in the Gulf to secure their own interests, and their whole framework to diversify suppliers is suddenly rendered inadequate. Trusting the 3-month clock means they are caught radically exposed. Which leads us to our final part, Section 4, pivoting to wartime footing. So what happens now? Well, when your short-term optimized planning totally fails, the only option left is an incredibly expensive, desperate pivot from standard operations straight into emergency measures. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast. The old doctrine was all about assuming short disruptions, holding 3-month reserves, operating with moderate urgency, and keeping the military out of it. It was lean, efficient, and cheap. But the new doctrine they're being forced into, it assumes disruptions could last 6 to 12 months, demands building an entire year of import cover, accelerates pipelines with absolute wartime urgency, and actively develops military options for maritime protection. It is a violent shift from an elegant theory to a brutal, highly militarized new reality. Ultimately, that 3-month assumption was comforting. It allowed for smooth sailing and high growth. But its destruction forces a much more expensive, militarized, and autarkic approach to energy, meaning they really have to become entirely self-sufficient, regardless of the massive cost. China's energy security doctrine is, in effect, being forced to violently grow up. And just like any massive corporate restructuring triggered by an existential crisis, growing up is painful, complex, and incredibly costly. Which leaves us with a final thought to consider as we wrap up today. If a doctrine this deeply entrenched can fail this incredibly fast in the face of physical reality, what other global supply assumptions out there are currently just running on borrowed time? It's a question that every business leader, strategist, and informed observer needs to be chewing on right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.